Scotland in the late 13th century, desolate fields, towering mountain ranges, and cold stone castles dotted across the northern land. This was not only a realm of wind and mist, but also a land of freedom, where the Scottish clans yearned for self-determination, even while living beside an ambitious giant, England. In 1286, tragedy struck Scotland. Alexander III, the powerful king who had brought peace and prosperity, perished on a stormy night when his horse slipped along a cliff. His sudden death left a terrifying vacuum of power. The sole heir was Margaret, the Maid of Norway, Alexander's granddaughter, only 3 years old. A kingdom desperate for a firm hand now had to depend on a child living far away in Norway. When Margaret died on her way to Scotland in 1290, that fragile hope shattered. The entire realm fell into the worst succession crisis in its history, more than 13 claimants vying for the throne. With Scotland divided, the southern neighbour acted at once. Edward III of England, called the Hammer of the Scots, declared himself arbiter to choose Scotland's king. In truth, he saw the perfect opportunity to reduce Scotland to a vassal. Edward placed John Balliol, a Scottish noble of little influence, on the throne, only to turn him quickly into a puppet. Balliol was forced to obey English commands, even sending hostages to London. The humiliation sparked outrage among the Scots. They wanted a true king, not a marionette. Out of that fury rose a name from the common folk, William Wallace. Not a great noble, but a little-known knight, he carried a burning hatred for English domination. In 1297, Wallace led a rebellion and won a stunning victory at Stirling Bridge, where his small force annihilated thousands of English soldiers. It was the moment Scotland proved that the weak could defeat the mightiest empire in Europe. Yet the glory was brief. A year later, at Falkirk, Edward I's Welsh longbowmen shattered Wallace's army. Hunted and betrayed, Wallace was captured and brutally executed in London in 1305. He died in agony, but the spirit of freedom he ignited never went out. Amid the turmoil, another name began to rise: Robert the Bruce. From a powerful family, Bruce was long mistrusted for his political maneuvering and tangled ties with both English and Scottish factions. In 1306, he shocked the realm by killing his rival John Comyn inside a church, a sacrilege denounced by the church itself. Yet that bloody act became a turning point. Bruce declared himself King of Scots, only to be hunted, defeated repeatedly, and forced into hiding in caves. Legend tells that in those desperate days, he watched a spider tirelessly spinning its web, failing again and again, yet never giving up. That story, myth or truth, became a symbol of resilience. If a spider could persist, then so could a king. Bruce rose anew. Abandoning half measures, he became a true guerrilla leader. He burned villages to deny English supplies, ambushed convoys, struck swiftly, then vanished. This war of shadows slowly bled the English dry. Step by step, Robert the Bruce regained the trust of his people. By the early 1310s, Scotland was not yet free. English garrisons still held mighty castles. Their armies still patrolled the land. But Bruce achieved what no one else had: national unity. The people saw in him a king who shared their hardships, not a puppet bowing to England. The decisive moment came in 1313. Bruce and his captains besieged Stirling Castle, the greatest English stronghold in central Scotland. The agreement was clear: if no relief arrived by June 1314, the fortress would surrender. This forced Edward II, the weak successor of Edward I, to act. Edward II gathered a colossal host, perhaps 20,000 men, including thousands of glittering knights, the finest cavalry in Europe. His aim: to crush Bruce, relieve Stirling, and restore the crown's prestige. Meanwhile, Bruce knew he had barely 6,000 fighters, peasants, smiths, and hardened rebels who had followed him for years. But he possessed what Edward II never could: the heart of a united nation and the mind of a master strategist. And so all roads led to a small place, Bannockburn, where one battle would decide not only Scotland's fate, but the very course of medieval European history. After nearly a decade of war, Robert the Bruce had turned Scotland into a fortress of resistance. He never met the English head-on when unprepared. Instead, he scorched fields, burned villages, and destroyed storehouses before the enemy could arrive. It was the cruel logic of scorched earth, to leave invaders nothing but barren soil, no food, no shelter. The once mighty English armies now trudged across charred plains, stomachs empty, spirits drained. Meanwhile, Bruce's raiding bands appeared like phantoms in the forests, striking swiftly, vanishing into the mist. The terror of these invisible Scots haunted English soldiers and eroded the will of their lords. When Edward the Fierce, the Hammer of the Scots, died in 1307, the English crown passed to his son, Edward II. But if the father was iron and fire, the son was the opposite. Edward II was infamous for indulgence, careless of war, and far too dependent on despised favourites. To the English, he never escaped his father's shadow. To the Scots, he was weak and unworthy. But in 1313, with Stirling under siege, Edward II had no choice: march north or watch England's authority collapse. Stirling was more than a fortress. It was the key to Scotland, commanding the roads that linked north and south. Whoever held Stirling held the nation's heart. And it was there, at Stirling, that Bruce set the stage for a reckoning. Robert the Bruce understood this well, and his brother Edward Bruce had besieged Stirling Castle since 1313. A pact was made: if by St. John's Day, June 24, 1314, no English relief arrived, the fortress would surrender. It was the perfect trap, forcing Edward II to march into battle at the time and place of Bruce's choosing. With his pride challenged, Edward II mustered one of the largest armies England had ever sent into Scotland. The numbers ranged from 15,000 to 20,000, a colossal host by medieval standards. It included thousands of armoured knights, ranks of the famed Welsh archers, and mercenaries from across Europe. The English advanced, convinced they would crush Bruce's army in a single battle. One arrogant noble even declared, "We need only sweep these savages aside so that we may feast together in Stirling." But that confidence soon became a burden. An army too vast, slow-moving, hard to coordinate, and shackled by its enormous need for food and supplies, its very size became a mortal weakness. In contrast, Robert the Bruce commanded only about 6,000 warriors. But these were no nameless spear carriers. They were men who had survived a decade of resistance, who had fought, fled, and even burned their own villages to deny the enemy. Unlike the English, bound by feudal obligation, the Scots fought for their homeland, their families, and their future. Each man had a personal reason to stand his ground. None wished to turn and flee. Bruce knew he could not meet the English in open fields. He needed ground that would trap them in narrow confines, where cavalry could not charge, where archers could not spread their deadly lines. And so he chose Bannockburn, near Stirling. Bannockburn was unique, a small stream with marshy banks cut across the battlefield. Woods and bogs surrounded the area. Only a few narrow paths allowed movement. For a massive army, it was a logistical and tactical nightmare. Bruce ordered pits dug and filled with sharpened stakes, then camouflaged with earth and grass. Hidden snares to topple war horses. He deployed his Shiltrons, dense circular formations bristling with long spears, nearly impregnable against cavalry. Every yard of soil, every bank of the stream, every narrow path was prepared to turn English strength into its own burden. The night before combat, the English erected a sprawling camp, noblemen's tents packed together, torchlight blazing across the sky. They believed in certain victory. Yet in the shadows whispers stirred about Robert the Bruce, the man who had escaped their blades time and again, the king the Scots revered as rightful. Meanwhile, the Scottish camp was small, meagre, but utterly unafraid. They knew well there was no retreat behind them. If they lost, it meant annihilation, and precisely because of that, their resolve was ironclad. One Scottish warrior is said to have declared, "Tomorrow we fight not only for our king, but for every home, every child, every drop of blood on this soil." And so, when the June sun rose, two armies faced each other across the narrow ground of Bannockburn. On one side stood the vast might of an empire, knights in gleaming armor, renowned archers, a sea of banners fluttering in the wind. On the other, a small army with eyes burning bright, their long spears glinting in the dawn. No one then could have known that in the next 2 days, on this very ground, the history of Europe would turn a page. That morning, on the marshy plain of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce confronted a brutal truth. He had fewer than 6,000 men, while Edward II commanded at least 15,000, 20,000. On paper, the balance of power leaned entirely to England. Any historian of the age would have sworn the outcome was inevitable. Scotland was doomed to be crushed. But Bruce thought otherwise. He knew war was not only about numbers. War was about terrain, discipline, morale, and strategy. Played well, the weak could bring down the giant. Bruce understood the core of English strength, the armoured cavalry. Knights on massive war horses clad in shining steel were seen as unstoppable engines of destruction. Yet he also knew their fatal weakness. They required wide, firm, dry ground to charge and unleash their crushing momentum. Bannockburn, with its boggy stream, thick woods, and narrow clearings, was the perfect place to turn cavalry advantage into a liability. Bruce forced the English to enter a funnel where horses could not maneuver and knights became lumbering targets. His secret weapon was no mystery at all, but the Shiltron, the infantry formation of defense. Imagine hundreds of men packed tightly together, each bearing a spear 10 to 15 feet long, bristling outward. From a distance, a Shiltron resembled a colossal iron hedgehog. Any knight charging in would see his horse impaled, himself ensnared amid a forest of spears. Once stripped of momentum, even the most heavily armoured knight was but a helpless prey for Scottish axes and swords. Bruce drilled his men to hold firm, never breaking formation, never fleeing. The strength of the Shiltron was not in the individual, but in the collective, a living wall of steel and discipline. What made Bruce's army different was also why they fought. The English fought from feudal duty. Many had little choice but to serve to preserve lands and titles. The Scots fought for hearth and kin, for their homes, their fields, their children, their freedom. A peasant might never match a knight's skill in single combat, but when he knew his family stood behind him, he would fight to the death. Bruce transformed this belief into a weapon, telling his soldiers they were not mere fighters, they were the very breath of a nation. Nor did Bruce rely on Shiltrons alone. Like a hunter, he set cunning snares. His men dug pits, lined them with stakes, and covered them with grass. To English cavalry they were invisible, until a single horse stumbled and chaos rippled through the ranks behind. The Bannockburn itself, with its marshy banks, trapped horses in mud, stripping away the speed they depended on. Each natural obstacle became part of Bruce's arsenal. The giant had entered the hunter's lair, and every path ahead was a trap. In addition, Bruce exploited the Bannockburn itself, just a small stream, but with marshy banks that turned horses into a burden. Knights charging across it found their mounts bogged down, their advantage in speed rendered useless. Chroniclers note that on the night before the battle, while his captains debated anxiously, Bruce remained strangely calm. He rode his horse to inspect every Shiltron, every pitfall, every narrow pass in the woods. He told his soldiers, "Tomorrow we need not be stronger than them, we only need to be more steadfast than them." Those words swept through the camp like a wind, transforming fear into resolve. At dawn on June 23rd, as the first rays of sunlight fell upon the battlefield, the Scottish formations were already in place. The Shiltrons blocked the narrow approaches, woods behind them, the marshy stream in front. Meanwhile, Edward II's massive army crowded together on the boggy ground. They still believed sheer numbers would crush their foe. Yet they did not realize that every yard of land beneath their feet was part of Bruce's carefully laid trap. The difference between the two armies was not only numbers, but also their view of war. To Edward II and his English nobles, battle was a display of power, a stage for knights to prove their glory. To Robert the Bruce and the Scots, war was a struggle for survival, where defeat meant the loss of everything. This contrast forged two opposing attitudes, one side overconfident, dismissive of its enemy, the other gritting its teeth, prepared for every thrust and spear. And history, more often than not, stands with those who have no way back. In truth, Bannockburn was not just a clash of armies, but a duel of kings. Edward II commanded more men, more weapons, more horses, but Bruce commanded deep knowledge of the land, the spirit of his nation, and the art of turning weakness into strength. His entire strategy could be summed in one principle: let the enemy destroy himself. In June 1314, night descended upon Bannockburn with heavy silence. In the English camp, thousands of torches lit the sky. Armored knights lay on the grass, dreaming of swift victory. Yet in the dark, uneasy whispers stirred, "Are we not fighting on ground chosen by the enemy?" Across the field, the Scottish camp was humbler, smaller, but its spirit blazed bright. Robert the Bruce walked among his men, reminding them to hold their Shiltrons. No one expected an easy fight, but all were ready to stand to the end. As dawn broke, both armies stirred. From the English side, the vanguard of cavalry thundered forward, their massive war horses clad in steel shaking the very earth. Among them was Sir Henry de Bohun, swelling with pride that if he could strike down Bruce, the war would end in an instant. He lowered his lance and charged directly at Bruce, who sat alone astride a small horse wearing no heavy armor. The entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Scotland's fate hung by a thread. But as Bohun's lance descended, Bruce sidestepped nimbly, avoiding the strike. In that instant he swung his battle-axe and split Bohun's helmet with a single crushing blow. The knight fell dead at once. The sight cracked the tension like lightning. The Scots erupted in a roar. Their king was not just a leader, but an invincible warrior. Across the field, English morale faltered. A noble knight of proud lineage had been felled before their eyes in one stroke. Shamed, the English cavalry threw themselves forward. They believed sheer momentum would shatter the Scottish spears. Instead, they met only the clash of iron, the screams of horses, and the spray of blood. War horses impaled upon spear points reared and toppled. Knights tumbled into the marsh. Hidden pits covered in grass broke the rhythm of entire squadrons. Instead of crushing the Scots, the English cavalry were crushed beneath their own weight. By evening, the English withdrew in confusion and heavy loss. The Scots, though fewer, still held firm. The first day closed with advantage tipping toward Bruce. In the English camp, gloom spread. Soldiers muttered that the land was cursed, that no god favored them. Edward II raged, cursing his captains, yet he could not deny the truth. The first day had been a humiliation. By contrast, the Scottish camp rang with song and prayer. They slept little, but possessed what their foes lacked, the conviction that victory lay within their grasp. At dawn, the English arrayed their great host for a decisive strike. Infantry and archers were pushed forward, meant to unleash storms of arrows to break the Shiltrons. Yet the narrow ground betrayed them. There was no room to deploy, and before they could fire, English cavalry blundered into their own lines. Seeing his moment, Bruce ordered the Shiltrons not to stand still but to advance. It was a daring move. The spear formations pressed forward, slowly but inexorably, driving the English into the marshy banks. Knights penned between mud, comrades, and a forest of spears floundered in chaos. A mighty army began to trap itself. At that moment, from the hills around, a mob of Scottish levies, blacksmiths, farmers, monks, came streaming down with crude weapons. They were not regular troops, but from afar, cloaked in dust, they looked like fresh reinforcements. Fear spread like a plague. Shouts of "More Scots are coming!" ripped through the English ranks. And when a vast army loses belief, collapse is inevitable. The English line broke. Proud knights abandoned their steeds and fled. Edward II himself, in panic, had to be escorted south by his guards. Some nobles were captured, many drowned trying to cross the rivers in their desperate escape. On the battlefield, the shouts of the Scots thundered. They had achieved the impossible. 6,000 men had routed 20,000, turning the might of a powerful empire into ashes. As the sun set on June 24th, Bannockburn lay strewn with dead soldiers, broken horses, shattered armor, and pools of blood. But on that ground, a new legend had been written, the legend of a small nation daring to rise against a giant and winning. On June 24, 1314, Bannockburn ended, leaving the field choked with corpses, fallen steeds, and ruined steel. For Scotland, it was more than a victory. It was a miracle in reality. A tiny army had broken the strength of the greatest power in Western Europe. Robert the Bruce, once an outlawed king, excommunicated by the Church, was now a national hero. Edward II, who had staked the English crown upon this battle, fled in disgrace, bearing home a defeat beyond excuse. When news of the disaster reached London, it cut into the kingdom's pride like a knife. Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, had once struck fear into the north, but Edward II left only the image of a weak, helpless monarch. The English nobility, already resentful of their king, now burned with fury. Bannockburn was proof, they said, that Edward was unworthy of the throne. In the years that followed, he would face rebellion, betrayal, and ultimately a miserable end. England's prestige abroad was also shattered. Once seen as Europe's policeman, England had been humbled by a tiny nation. It emboldened others, from Ireland to Wales, that even a giant could be brought low. Bannockburn was not only political, militarily, it transformed the way Europe saw war. For centuries, the armored knight had been considered invincible, the very symbol of feudal power. Yet at Bannockburn, disciplined infantry, organized into Shiltrons, proved that they could repel and even destroy knights. It marked a turning point, heralding the decline of the mounted aristocracy and the rise of infantry in later wars. In the centuries ahead, English longbowmen at Crecy, Swiss pikemen and Swedish foot soldiers would all follow the path Bruce and the Scots had carved. For the Scottish people, Bannockburn was a triumphant hymn of courage and unity. It showed that as long as they stood together, they could defeat any foe. From this point, Bruce was no longer merely a political leader, but a living symbol of independence. The clans that had once quarreled set aside their rivalries to defend the kingdom as one. The victory also solidified Bruce's power, turning his throne from fragile to secure. He no longer needed to prove himself worthy. Bannockburn had done it for him. 8 years after the victory in 1320, the lords and nobles of Scotland sent the Declaration of Arbroath to the Pope. It remains one of the most important documents in European history, asserting that a king's power exists only so long as he defends the liberty of his people. It contained the famous words, "As long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is not for glory, nor for riches, nor honors that we fight, but for freedom, alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself." It is not hard to see the spirit of Bannockburn woven into every line of that declaration. Through the centuries, Bannockburn has lived on not just as a battle, but as a national legend. Poets and musicians celebrated it in ballads and songs. Scots told of Bruce's axe cleaving Bohun's skull by the fireside, recounting it as a symbol of their pride. Even hundreds of years later, in political or cultural struggles, Bannockburn was invoked as proof that Scotland was born to be free, not to be subdued. Today, looking back at Bannockburn, it is clear it was not just a clash in a war of independence. It was a moment that shaped the very identity of the Scottish nation. A people may be small, but united and unyielding, they can achieve the extraordinary. Bannockburn taught Europe that power does not lie only in numbers or armor, but in will, in strategy, and in belief. And that lesson echoes still, from the Middle Ages down to our own time.